largest beef recall in U.S. history. 143 million pounds of frozen beef.
From a company that used sick and abused animals.
And they've tried to pass laws designed to keep the public in the dark.
They've been lobbying a lot of states to pass what are called ag-gag laws.
Outraged citizens have fought back, often clashing with law enforcement and being labeled terrorists.
The FBI arrests 2 animal rights activists for what's being called domestic terrorism.
I am not completely innocent of any infractions, but one thing I certainly wasn't was a terrorist.
How did a group of animal rights activists reveal years of government-corporate collusion?
The answers to that question are in these meetings.
And using new technology and the Freedom of Information Act, how did they plant the seeds for a bigger battle over government transparency?
We need to know what the fuck the government is doing.
In 2002, journalist Will Potter worked at the Chicago Tribune Metro desk.
I was just covering breaking news, blood and guts, what we call cop shop, which is just a lot of late nights, a lot of going into really awful neighborhoods, reporting really horrible things. It was just leaving me feeling really dark and depressed. And it was not what I went into journalism wanting to do. It was just crushing me. I had done some activism in college, and I thought that the most I could do now, working full-time at a newspaper like the Tribune, would be to go out leafleting. I feel like I was doing something positive. They were just passing out these flyers about animal testing. And of course I had the absolute worst luck ever, and we were all arrested. And yeah, absolutely. Immediately arrested, charged with disorderly conduct. It's a Class C misdemeanor. A couple weeks later, I was visited by 2 FBI agents, and they told me that unless I helped them by spying on protest groups, they'd put me on a domestic terrorist list. And that was really a turning point for me. It scared the daylights out of me. And when that fear subsided, though, I really became obsessed with this issue. How people who are doing something so benign as passing out leaflets could be threatened with being listed as domestic terrorists.
The words domestic terrorist were frightening, but Potter wanted to find out why he was being threatened with that label. He soon found an ally in Ryan Shapiro, whose passion for animal rights had begun at a young age.
I was very concerned with social justice and radical politics and punk rock. I watched footage from undercover investigations at factory farms, and I was just horrified. It was hens who were forced to lay battery eggs or kept in cages so small they can't stand up, turn around, spread their limbs. And I realized I had to do something to actively combat that.
What he did was co-found SEAL, the NYU Animal Rights Group, and the New York City Animal Defense League while in college in the 90s. Soon after, he joined forces with activists Lauren Gazzola and Andrew Stepanian.
Ryan and Andy and I and a number of other folks were kind of the core organizers of grassroots animal rights activism in the city in the late 90s.
We would frequently hold many protests at Macy's because of their sale of fur.
We didn't have the resources that major lobbyist groups have, so what were we working with? We were working with, actually impacting someone's profits. We closed those doors to Macy's for maybe 6 hours, and obviously put a dent in their revenue for the day.
After college in the early 2000s, Ryan Shapiro focused on animal rights issues like freeing ducks used to make foie gras. Lauren Gazzola and Andy Stepanian went in a different direction and focused on halting animal testing at Huntington Life Sciences, a pharmaceutical and chemical research organization. Activists were outraged by undercover footage that included a Huntington employee abusing dogs. They fought back with a campaign called SHACK.
Stop Huntington Animal Cruelty was an international grassroots campaign to close the animal testing laboratory, Huntington Life Sciences.
Shack decided to hit Huntington Life Sciences where it hurt, their bottom line. Activists used mailings, black faxes, phone campaigns, and protests to push companies to break ties with Huntington.
Huntington needed investors, stockbrokers, insurance in order to survive, but these companies don't need Huntington. We were vocal in our support of any tactic, both lawful and unlawful, that didn't physically injure anybody.
The tactics worked. Daryl Johnson was an analyst for the Department of Homeland Security at the time.
Anybody that was associated with Huntington Life Sciences, whether it was DHL, the courier that was carrying the lab rat, the bank that was funding the research, the insurance company, they targeted a wide range of companies and they dissected that network pretty accurately and pretty quickly.
So the victories that we were seeing were some of the largest companies in the world cutting their ties with this lab. And we're talking Citibank, Merrill Lynch, huge companies that were being influenced by grassroots activists.
And we were relying on the greed of capitalism to be its own Achilles heel, and that people wanted to get out and sell and make as much profit as possible, and so we kind of turned them on each other.
In an extraordinary Wall Street event, only 45 minutes before the morning bell, Huntington executives were shocked to learn that the initial listing of their parent company on the New York Stock Exchange was postponed.
Distressed, astonished, speechless, the reaction of the head of Huntington Life Sciences.
You know, is this just the tip of the iceberg as regards the potential for the New York Stock Exchange to be affected by extremist pressure?
Just a month and a half later, in a congressional hearing, Huntington Life Sciences General Counsel Mark Beebe urged action against the perceived threat of Shack.
The New York Stock Exchange reopened for business only 4 business days after the 9/11 terrorist attacks. Yet apparently purely on the basis of a perceived threat from Shack, the NYSE postponed plans to list our stock. A handful of animal extremists have succeeded where Osama bin Laden had failed.
Now, with the animal rights movement in particular, they're threatening corporate profits in very specific ways. The animal activists are demanding more widespread reform. They're doing it through ballot initiatives, through legislation, and through sometimes illegal underground activity. Every aspect of it is a threat to money, and I think corporations realize that.
We were winning against extremely powerful corporations.
I think there's a real understanding that, you push the envelope too far, you become a little too effective. Naturally, those people in power are going to start pushing down on you.
That pushing became official when the FBI reassured Congress and businesses at the hearing that they had the activists in their sights.
Investigating and preventing animal rights extremism is one of our highest domestic terrorism priorities. We are committed to working with our partners to disrupt and dismantle these movements, to protect our fellow citizens, and to bring to justice those who commit crime and terrorism in the name of animal rights.
Gazzola, Stepanian, and others involved in the movement were caught in the crosshairs as the government's intense focus on animal rights activists labeled their civil disobedience a form of terrorism.
Animal rights and environmental activists have been labeled as the FBI's #1 domestic terrorism threat.
There's some common misperceptions in the public and media about what terrorism is, and it has nothing to do with a body count or whether you injured or killed someone. It's a violent act for a social political objective that instills fear in a population or attempts to influence government policy.
I think it's the most powerful word in our language right now. When you hear that word terrorism, it immediately goes to 9/11. I mean, there's no separating it anymore. It's impossible to recover from that.
The U.S. government charged Gazzola, Stepanian, and the other defendants with conspiracy to cause disruption, harm, and property loss to Huntington business. This charge fell under the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Statute.
And their business, quite frankly, is thuggery and intimidation.
Gazzola and Stepanian faced years in prison.
I am not completely innocent of any infractions of the law, but one thing I certainly wasn't was a terrorist.
Through the early 2000s, the Shack 7 activists worked to shut down animal testing at Huntington Life Sciences. Gazzola, Stepanian, and others believed their actions were justified civil disobedience. The government determined it was more. In 2006, they were convicted as terrorists.
When I arrived in the Bureau of Prisons, in their computer systems was this kind of designation of great severity that was associated with terrorism.
My conviction is animal enterprise terrorism. I was sentenced to 52 months.
I served 3 years in prison.
The goal was clearly to scare people out of doing their activism.
It worked. The prosecution of the Shack 7 sent a chill through the animal rights community. Activists feared they could face the same fate.
That's one of the most dangerous consequences of this terrorism rhetoric, is that it makes people think even for a moment of what happens if I speak up. Can I go to this protest? Am I going to end up on a file? And that has a chill. No one is saying you can't protest anymore, but the message is being sent, do you really want to go stick your neck out?
That chilling effect took its toll on the movement as a whole, and it left Ryan Shapiro determined to find out what was going on behind the wall of secrecy.
I started a PhD really trying to make sense of how we got to this state of affairs. How did the animal rights movement first come to the attention of the FBI? How did the FBI's understanding of the animal rights and environmental movements evolve over time? What's the role of industry?
Just how were government agencies and corporations colluding behind closed doors to target activists? And how did protesters get labeled as terrorists? To answer those questions, Potter, Shapiro, and others turned their attention to liberating something new: information.
The documents that would answer these questions, they're in the back rooms of the FBI, the Department of Justice, the ATF. Not knowing any other way to try and get those records, I started submitting a couple Freedom of Information Act requests.
The Freedom of Information Act, or FOIA, was created in 1966 and first signed into law by President Lyndon Johnson.
FOIA, or the Freedom of Information Act, is a pretty radical tool. It basically says that citizens have the right to get access to what the government is doing.
Having never before used FOIA, Shapiro started submitting requests for government records on the activist he knew best, himself.
The FBI responded that they didn't have anything on me. And then I submitted a request on another friend of mine, and the FBI had raided her house. I got the same answer. No, we don't have anything.
With every obstacle he encountered, Shapiro refined his tactics and relentlessly pursued his goal. Animal rights activism had become a battle for something bigger: information and transparency.
So I started submitting hundreds of requests.
Ryan is kind of a FOIA ninja.
My OCD, contempt for the FBI, and need for conflict at times may have been problematic, but here it worked out very well.
He obsessively went through and learned all of the protocol, all the rules, all the filing systems of the FBI.
But the FBI still set up roadblocks. Fighting unjustified redactions, long delays, and poor searches, Shapiro needed another weapon: FOIA attorney Jeffrey Light.
FOIA was designed to be very easy to do and to be accessible to anybody who wanted to do it. The problem comes in actually getting the records. Particular types of documents they will always reject. Other times, the government just wants to keep secrets. I've had clients get back 500 pages of just completely black ink.
When an agency doesn't comply with the law, one is allowed to sue. So that's what we did. Jeff and I sued the FBI.
Ryan asked about dozens of animal rights activists and organizations. And the FBI's response when we got into court is that Ryan's project of requesting all of this information was a threat to national security.
It simply should not take an MIT scholar and an expert specialist attorney in order to get records from the government. But we need to know what the fuck the government is doing.
Ryan Shapiro and Jeffrey Light were trying to uncover FBI documents to shed light on a driving question: why were animal rights groups being targeted and even being labeled terrorists? To get the documents, they sued the government. While the case is ongoing, they won this battle.
Right now we're looking at new release stuff. How did the animal rights and environmental movements go from it being of essentially no criminal interest to the FBI to being the leading domestic terror threats in the country? And this is that. The answers to that question are in these meetings. The fur industry came to the DOJ and said, we're sick of cops treating protesters as protesters. We want you to treat them as terrorists. And here's a list of the people we want. The DOJ sends a list to the FBI and says, get on it.
This document showed direct collaboration between the fur industry and federal law enforcement. Shapiro and Light's years of work were finally showing visible results.
It is shocking when you start seeing the direct, heavy-handed involvement of corporate interest in drafting legislation, directing prosecutions, and shaping government priorities.
But those government priorities revealed by FOIA were only half the story.
FOIA, of course, only applies to government records. So if you want to get records to learn about what a private corporation is doing, you have to have other means to do that. Undercover videos, taking a photograph. The animal agriculture industry, they've been lobbying a lot of states to pass what are called ag-gag laws.
Hidden video taken on farms, often taken by whistleblowers, could be banned in the state.
Many call this the ag-gag bill after...
The now widely adopted term ag-gag was coined by best-selling author and journalist Mark Bittman in 2011.
Ag-gag means a law that restricts photography and video that exposes animal cruelty on factory farms or a broad range of animal enterprises.
The animal agriculture industry was pushing states to adopt new laws that would keep their practices out of the public eye.
We can legally take pictures of someone's children, but we can't take pictures of their livestock. I'm anxious to hear how this is justified.
The video and still pictures can be manipulated, and it makes the industry look bad. There's other ways out there to ensure that the treatment of animals is proper and humane.
By stopping the collection of evidence, you no longer can show systemic abuse.
This worker appears to be standing over where we saw the bulldozer dump the cow who's still alive. Hi, fine, how are you? I've just never seen what this place looked like.
This farm protection legislation, which has been termed ag-gag legislation by the activist community, is extremely important. This legislation is meant to protect the right of these people to continue to operate their farms and ranches and to continue to provide food to this hungry country and the world.
Opponents of ag-gag laws argue that unappealing practices are being hidden from consumers who have a right to know.
There is a public interest in what's going on in these farms, and the videos that are taken record a crime or a practice that's just fundamentally unappealing to consumers.
Consumers care what's actually happening. They don't want to buy this stuff anymore. Rather than actually changing their business practices or, responding to consumer pressure, the industry is trying to kill the whistleblower.
That battle against whistleblowers has played out in state after state as activists go up against government and animal industries. Currently, 8 U.S. states have ag-gag laws. In 2015, North Carolina passed the most far-reaching bill yet, expanding the secrecy beyond animal agriculture.
North Carolina ag-gag law is worse than any of the other offending ag-gag laws.
Eyewitness News learned a new bill just passed by North Carolina lawmakers could impact everyone from vulnerable children to the elderly.
It would apply to all North Carolina companies, so think daycares, adult care facilities, supermarkets, environmental concerns, it doesn't matter.
What started as a concern for animal rights became much more. A fight for transparency and information.
When you see the ag industry successfully pass legislation that keeps people in the dark, that's a tool that other industries want. Why wouldn't auto manufacturers want that? Why wouldn't the tobacco industry want that? Why wouldn't pharmaceuticals want that? You can't make informed decisions in a democracy. You can't make choices about our lives unless you actually have hard-hitting information about what's taking place.
To bring attention to ag-gag laws and to document the environmental impact of factory farms, Will Potter has tried something new. He's taken to the sky with drones.
I saw these photographs by an artist named Michigan Henner, who was using satellite imagery of factory farms.
These arresting images are lagoons of manure and byproducts from factory farming.
It showed the scope and scale of this destruction in a new way. The United Nations reports that significant contribution to global warming comes from factory farming and animal agriculture.
I'm interested in raising more awareness about ag-gag laws and showing that we have to continue doing the work. And the second part is to get a better scope of the environmental impact, which I think can really be done through the air.
The farms we're looking at aren't necessarily, the worst of the worst or anything like that. They're pretty representative of the industry as a whole right now.
All right.
My work started out really focusing on
how animal rights activists were being labeled as terrorists, but it's expanded to broader issues of transparency and accountability.
The moment you start closing off everything and putting everything behind closed doors, then you're not inviting people to be part of democracy anymore.
It is certainly an enormous task to challenge huge corporations and huge governments, but if we let that keep us from fighting, well, then there would never have been any social change ever.
It doesn't matter what you think about animal rights or environmental issues, what you think about the activists who I report on. These issues affect everybody.
How's it going? Just flying around.
You have permission for that?
Don't need permission for that.
You gotta have permission to go over private property.
That's not true at all.
I mean, the industry is not backing away from ag. It's just trying new ways of keeping people in the dark. And I think it's really a matter of being vigilant and monitoring this legislation and using FOIA and open records methods to find out what's actually taking place so we can stop it.
Democracy is essentially meaningless without an understanding of what our government is up to.
We have to know what's going on, or all of a sudden we wake up in a country that we don't even recognize.